Salmon are returning to spawn. This week's show is brought to you by the salmon of the Tri-Cities.
Salmon are an integral part of the ecosystem that we enjoy on the West Coast. I mean, they really are the icon of the West Coast, what it means to be West Coast. So there have been tremendous amount of pressures put on salmon and salmon habitat over the last 30 to 50 years. And in the 90s, I decided that I was going to do something about that. So I swam. I was a swimmer, so I swam across Georgia Strait initially, and then in 1995, I swam the length of the Fraser River, which is the largest salmon river in Canada, and it's one of the largest salmon rivers and most significant salmon rivers in the world, in fact. And this river has its problems. It's been on the endangered list, the threatened rivers list in British Columbia for a number of years, and it's because of all the pollution, the overfishing, and climate change, and the threats, the industrial threats, whether it's forestry, gravel, ranching, agriculture. There's so many threats along this river system that have put pressure on the river that I decided to do this swim to raise awareness and to try to turn the situation around so that we can have salmon in our future. Overall, the trend hasn't been good for sockeye, for salmon in general, as it hasn't for many fisheries around the world. So now, as a Member of Parliament, sitting on the Fisheries and Oceans Committee, I'm looking into these issues, not only on the fishery, but I'm looking at ocean issues as well, because not only is the freshwater a critical part of studying the problems and the solutions, but also the oceans where these salmon spend the majority of their lives. That is a big issue as well. Well, one of the biggest concerns that I've seen at a federal level is the recent changes to the Fisheries Act. Now, the Fisheries Act is one of the strongest pieces of legislation in the country to protect fish habitat, essentially the environment. That has come under attack. It was changed earlier this year through an omnibus bill, which generally means a number of pieces of legislation that are amended at once. So in the House of Commons, there was a vote through a bill C-38, which was called an omnibus bill. It had almost 70 pieces of legislation that were being amended at once. Now, normally in the House of Commons, parliamentarians vote on changing one bill or approving one or voting on one piece of legislation at a time. Here we were looking at almost 70 pieces of legislation at once. So I think there's a real question about the democratic process that was affected here with this omnibus bill vote. But putting that aside for a second and just focusing on one of those pieces of legislation that were changed and looking at that, it was the Fisheries Act. There were many other important pieces of environmental protection legislation that were amended as well. But just looking at the Fisheries Act, there was a very significant change to the Act where the government decided to remove the protection of fish habitat. Now that is critical, and that's in Section 35(1) of the Fisheries Act. And that's critical because that removal of protecting fish habitat is the trigger for a lot of environmental reviews of major projects. So for instance, if you want to put in a pipeline or you want to build a road, if that pipeline crosses a stream or if that road crosses a stream or watercourse, or if you want to build a house that is within a watercourse or near a watercourse, if you want to mine something, or if you want to cut trees down to close to watercourses, all of those proposals require an environmental review. Now with the changes to the Fisheries Act, these recent changes, that is going to weaken the protection for our fisheries. And our fisheries are already in trouble. And I predict that this will increase the amount of pressure or or stress that's put on our fishery, in other words, our salmon, in places like the Fraser River and many other big river systems in the province. What really should have happened is those particular pieces should have gone to the respective committees. So for instance, the change to the Fisheries Act should have gone to the Fisheries Committee. You would think that's a natural and obvious thing to do so that the Fisheries Committee could provide their input, provide their advice to whether or not these proposed changes make sense. Now, I would have disagreed strongly with the changes that they were proposing, but at least the government could have heard that in the Fisheries Committee. However, they chose not to do that. What they did was they created subcommittees of the Finance Committee. So to review all of the information at once, which is essentially an impossible task because it takes a lot of time just to review the Fisheries Act alone, not to mention the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, and there were pensions being affected, old age security, employment insurance. I mean, it had everything in this bill, and it was not being reviewed properly, thoroughly. There was no public consultation on these massive changes. So there really is an issue of democracy here that is being affected. With this omnibus bill, you're seeing a move, a really strong move to US-style government. So the most controversial project that many British Columbians and Canadians are aware of right now is the Northern Enbridge Gateway project. So that proposal is calling for a twin pipeline to go from Alberta's oil sands or tar sands to the coast of Kitimat in British Columbia, northern British Columbia. That will run 1,100 kilometers through some of the most rugged terrain in British Columbia, and it will cross upwards of 600-700 streams. Many of those have fish in them. So with that proposal, obviously that would, you would think, trigger an environmental review to make sure that if that was to go ahead, which many Canadians are opposed, and New Democrats have come out, federal New Democrats, we're opposed to that proposal. But that project would, if it goes ahead, which is what the federal government is proposing, the Conservative government has already come out and said that they want to see this project go ahead. They're being very open about that. Then you would think an environmental review is critical. Now, it would be critical with the strongest legislation in the country, in other words, the Fisheries Act, intact, but now it's been amended in order to, and I'll say, facilitate or fast-track that project if it was to go forward. They've weakened that legislation by removing critical habitat or the protection of habitat, which is the trigger for those reviews. And that I find unacceptable, and I think many Canadians, once they learn about that, will find that unacceptable as well. Now with these recent changes to our Fisheries Act and our environmental review process, the international community is looking in saying, what's going on in Canada? You seem to be fast-tracking oil projects which are promoting the use of carbon and increasing the amount of carbon. We know that the scientific community knows overwhelmingly that we are contributing to an increase of carbon in the atmosphere. We know this is a problem, and this government is not doing anything about it. So we, as New Democrats, have proposed legislation that would actually have a strong, comprehensive climate change strategy for the country. And we saw in the last Parliament that was, it actually made it through Parliament, but it was killed in the Senate. The appointed or not elected Senate, which was called in a snap decision to a vote to kill that very progressive piece of legislation that could have helped with Canada's image, which is turning as an environmental laggard. So This is very unfortunate. It's a very unfortunate trends that Canada isn't, which it really could be a strong country of democratic process and of green and properly stewarding not only our land but our oceans as well. I mean, Canada is an ocean nation, and I think we should be looking at how we have a strong and prosperous economy with good democratic processes in place, but protecting that foundation of which Canada is known for, which is salmon and rivers and oceans and trees and biodiversity and animal life. It's an amazing place, Canada. So I really don't want to see that changed, and I want to see that our country flourish in terms of our environment and as well as our communities and our economies. And I think it can be done, but we cannot have one without the other. And it seems with this current government, the Conservative government, they're really focused on only the economy and at the expense of our environment.